Hello, and welcome to our weekly live stream dialogue with Helga Zepp-LaRouche, the founder and chairwoman of the Schiller Institute. It's July 12th, 2023. I'm Harley Schlanger, and I'll be your host today. You can send us your questions and comments at questions@schillerinstitute.org. The two irreconcilable trajectories in world strategic affairs were both in motion over the last days. NATO's been meeting in Vilnius, Lithuania, reaffirming its commitment to war, highlighted by the agreement to ship cluster munitions, or by the United States' willingness to ship cluster munitions to Ukraine, in violation of a convention agreement signed by more than 120 nations. And while the war hawks were gathered there, the higher peace movement convened in Strasbourg, France, with a conference, an excellent conference this last weekend. And also last Friday, there was a follow-up call of the International Peace Coalition, as that's moving, maybe not as fast as it needs to, but it is moving. Now, Helga, let's begin with a question that reflects the tensions between these two directions, the unipolar war paradigm and the mobilization for a new strategic and development architecture. I'll start with a question from Susanna Curatolo, who asks, are we at a strategic peace inflection point? So give us your analysis of where things stand and if in fact we are at that kind of inflection point.
Well, yeah, I mean, we are definitely at the end of a whole era. I think that the outcome of the NATO summit, I think a lot of theatrics were played around it, because I was looking into the various scenarios which were published by mainly the German think tanks, DGAP, Deutsche Gesellschaft für Auswärtige Politik, and SWP, I forgot now what it stands for. It's the other major government-related think tank. And if you look at their scenarios, it was very clear from the beginning that they would not offer full membership to Ukraine, nor would they offer a timetable for NATO, for Ukraine entering NATO. But it was very clear that there was a decision long before that the MO would be to basically, arm Ukraine to the hilt with long-range weapons, where Macron came in, France is now delivering long-range weapons, and all the other major weapon systems will be supplied. Germany will supply 70 more tanks, 700 million euro more of military equipment, other countries doing likewise. So there is a tremendous military buildup of Ukraine, and an agreement to streamline, the military exercises and training and everything with NATO standard. So, if you really look at the substance of it, it seems to me that it's everything but a formal NATO membership. But, basically integration and intelligence, help with cyber attacks if they come. So, in a certain sense, it looked like a lot of theater to me. President Zelensky made a big, show, basically saying that he was so disappointed that there was no timetable. But then, as the summit proceeded, he was very satisfied with the result. So I think that, the problem with the summit was that it is the global NATO agenda. They had one whole session for the guests, which was the Pacific 4 countries. I think it was Japan, Australia, New Zealand, and South Korea. And a lot of discussion was, about China in this context, that the problems of the Euro-Atlantic are the problems of the Indo-Pacific and vice versa. So, if you leave away all the confetti and discussion, it is the agenda global NATO. It is the agenda of treating not only Russia, but also China increasingly as an adversary. And there was absolutely no possibility of ending the war, of having some kind of a negotiated peace. So in a certain sense, it is unfortunately, exactly what was expected to be. So in that sense, I don't see an inflection point there. But I do see an inflection point that the situation is so tense that it cannot continue. I mean, what is this thing about, making this long-term commitment for the military build-up of Ukraine, when obviously the Western economies are in terrible condition? I mean, there was this thing where President Biden said that the reason why the United States decided to send cluster bombs, and Biden almost had a crocodile tear saying he was making it so hard to make this decision. But, basically he had to make it because these other ammunitions had run out. Now, this poses a lot of questions. How can it be that the strongest military power in the world, the United States, which has right now a military budget of $1 trillion per year, I mean, that's not peanuts, that's $1 trillion, that they cannot produce enough ammunition to keep feeding this war? Russia was supposed to have collapsed. Wasn't that the story? Well, I mean, Jen Psaki, the former White House spokeswoman, she had said a year ago that if Russia would use cluster weapons, and she at that point said that she had no evidence that that was the case, it would represent a war crime. Now, if the United States is sending cluster weapons, does that represent a war crime, or are there two different standards? Well, I think that somehow makes the whole point, that if you look at the final document, the communique which NATO put out, all the statements of where we are at are highly questionable. You can challenge practically each single sentence because it is the official narrative about the unprovoked war by Russia, and a lot can be said, and it is a lot being said about it by all kinds of people, intellectuals in the United States, peace proponents in Europe. They are all pointing to the fact that history did not start on the 24th of February 22, but indeed there was the broken promises of Baker, Secretary of State Baker to Gorbachev, and all these other developments. So cluster bombs, are absolutely a war crime. There is no question about it, because, even the I think President or Prime Minister, I'm not sure, from Cambodia, Hun Sen, came out and warned against the use of cluster bombs, saying that more than 50 years after the war in his country has ended, there are still hundreds of people every year who either get killed or are mutilated by exploding bombs. And the number of cluster bombs which the United States is now planning to deliver to Ukraine are 300 million. Now, can you imagine 300 million bombs where they claim that only 2.5% or so are failures and therefore they can explode later? Well, the experience shows that that's not quite so, that it's between 20 and 40% of these bombs which don't detonate in the beginning. And therefore, if they are somewhere in the countryside, they can kill people decades later. And, this will also be a big problem because much of this is the arable land in Ukraine. And, so what is supposed to happen with the farmers who are supposed to farm that land after the war is over? It will contaminate that land for a long time to come. So I think this is really terrible, and it just calls for the international peace movement to become much more active. We absolutely have to demand that this war is being ended through negotiations. And, to say that if you are demanding an end to the war, you are already, a war or promoting the war. It's not true. we always said we agree with Pope Francis that who offered the territory or the venue of the Vatican for negotiations, that these negotiations should start without precondition. And obviously, given the fact that we are promoting the idea of a new security and development architecture, which must take into account the interest of every single country on the planet, that naturally the interest of both Ukraine and Russia must be taken into account. That's self-evident, otherwise you don't get a peace agreement. So I think that, people should really think twice when they read these outcomes of this summit, which I think is, as such, not an inflection point. But I think the story that the NATO is so unified, that's not true. I think the inflection point comes from the fact that it's based on the idea, that all of this will be done, the military buildup will be done, when the United States cannot even produce in time the ammunition, conventional ammunition, and when all the reports are that the German industry is deindustrialized. Now, I think this will have a huge explosion to come. I don't think this will go on forever, because as of now, I think the latest figure published was that 36% of all German firms are considering to invest elsewhere, but in Germany, because the conditions are just becoming intolerable. So Germany is looking in front, looking in the face of a complete collapse of its industry, which will have an incredible impact on the social system. Already now they're closing down hospitals, all under the pretext of a medical reform to do away with not efficient hospitals. But that's not the whole point why you have hospitals. Hospitals have to be within reach. If you have a heart attack or some other accident, if you have to travel for several hours, you probably are dead, but you have to have a regional hospital to cover for all of these emergencies. And they have closed down hundreds of hospitals. They're planning to close down another, I think, 500 hospitals in Germany alone. One can actually look at, the cost which is being, all this value, which is misdirected in the armament industry. This is all physical value which could be used for, the health system, the education system, schools, training programs for young people. I mean, all kinds of urgent things, infrastructure. This is all being neglected. Instead, everything is put in the chimney of the military-industrial complex, and it's being blown out into smoke, meaning a complete destruction of actual wealth of society. And I think that is the time bomb, where the fuse is burning, because I think that with the collapsing system and the social consequences of this cannot be maintained forever. So my sense of it is that the Achilles heel of this entire NATO monster, and it is a monster, is that it's a coloss on clay feet, because the economy on which it's based is totally rotten.
Now, we have a couple of questions about the pulling together of an alternative system. First, from on the conference, from Thomas B. He said, "Thank you for the conference," referring to, I believe, the Strasbourg conference. "Bringing people from all nations together for united purposes for humanity, that's what's needed." Now, on that, there's a question from Mushtaq Mirani, who's an engineering professor, who writes, "We need concrete solutions to address national interests of different countries. How do you do that?"
Well, I mean, it's really very easy, because, if you go to the first principle of my proposed 10 principles for the new security and development architecture, the first principle is that every single nation must be absolutely sovereign. Because, in the same way, like there is no passepartout for the right way to do things, you have to consider in each nation the cultural tradition, the specifics of geography, demographics, all kinds of factors which are different in each country. And it has to be the sovereign decision of every country to choose the pathway of their own development. But the principles of physical economy, they are universal. I mean, the very important conception which was developed by my late husband, Lyndon LaRouche, that there is a correlation between the energy flux density used in the production process and the population density, the relative potential population density, which can be maintained with the level of energy flux density used in the production process. That is true for every country. It doesn't matter if you have a so-called communist economy or if you have an economy which is more, let's say, mercantilist or more, free market. Even so, that's the most problematic because of the reasons given by Friedrich List and Henry C. Carey why that problem exists. But, then once you have that settled, that each nation has the right for their own development, but that there are universal principles of physical economy, what is productive and what is not productive, then you can have a harmonious collaboration of the different microcosms pursuing their own interest to have the maximum beneficial development within the microcosm, but treating the development of the other microcosms as their own interest and vice versa, so that then the development of all microcosms represent the harmony in the macrocosms, meaning the world economy as a whole. So this is really not so difficult because, once you have the respect for the sovereignty of the other, the principle of non-interference into the other social system, the respect for, the other country to pursue their own way of doing things, it's very easy. The only reason why people think or countries think that they have such a difficulty with their neighbors is because if you have, if you're following Mondeville, he was the one so-called economist who said that private vice contributes to the public common good, meaning that if you have a lot of criminals who then all need lawyers and therefore the caste of lawyers and judges become rich, and therefore if you have a private criminal, it still contributes to the common good. That's obviously, a very thinly covered cover story for a criminal system. But on the other side, when you have a system as it used to be for periods of time in Europe in existence, for example, when Charles de Gaulle was in France, France was going in this direction. With Adenauer, Germany was definitely going in this direction. With Enrico Mattei in Italy, the Italian state did tend in this direction. And if every state, every nation is promoting their own common good, not having this kind of casino economy overhang, then it is very easy to have a harmony of interest among all nations.
I think the other point is that negotiation and discussion is the way you arrive at that, as opposed to bullying and threats. Now, there's a question from a listener from the Republic Broadcast Network out of Dallas, Texas, who asks, will the BRICS introduce a new currency in their August meeting? And will they allow Macron to attend?
Well, I don't know. There are reports that they may do that, but it may also not happen. So I don't have certain information about that. Because obviously, you have a problem when you have an international currency. For example, when you think about the introduction of the euro, where you had, basically an international currency which did not take into account the fact that you had very developed countries, or very industrialized countries, I should say, and then more agrarian countries and more developed countries, less developed countries. So you have to consider a lot of, a lot of things, and obviously such an international currency would be a parallel currency to other currencies. So, maybe the problems represent themselves a little bit different. So I'm not sure. It's a difficult thing and it has to be done right. And there are a lot of obstacles to be overcome. So I have to postpone the answer to that question to a later point, because I don't think the information is totally verifiably there. Concerning Macron, I would be very surprised if Macron would be invited, because, the countries of the Global South, as they have demonstrated at the International Finance Summit, which took place in France a good week ago, they don't want to take bullshit anymore. And when you should have seen, maybe you should watch this video about this International Financial Summit, because when President Ramaphosa of South Africa was answering and said, look, you finance for us the Inga Dam in Congo, which will give electricity to, I think 12 nations, or maybe less, five or seven nations of Africa. Given the fact that 600 million people in Africa still don't have access to electricity, then we believe you that you are serious. But basically, we don't want to hear your Sunday sermons anymore. These are now my words. The camera, was turned on Macron, and he looked really horrified about this answer. And I think that resolve, that the countries of the Global South, these are countries who have suffered in part 500 years of colonialism, and after the post-war period and the so-called independence, which they got at different times, they saw that the system of colonialism persisted in the forms of the IMF conditionalities, in the form of trade conditions, the rules of the WTO, and similar things. So they really have come to the point, that they do not want this anymore. And since they do have an alternative right now in the form of China, the Belt and Road Initiative, the BRICS, and many other organizations like the SCO and other organizations now evolving, I think that, I would be surprised, if Macron will be invited. I'm sure he will have to behave, but I'm not sure he will be invited in the first place.
I'm not sure he could behave. Another question along these lines, this is from someone whose email address is Go Global South, asks the question, will India be suckered into an active role with the Quad, and is Biden trying to pull India away from Russia?
The latter, the answer to the latter is for sure yes. The democratic West, those rule-based, value-based people who have no problem in sending cluster bombs to Ukraine. Steinmeier, who is naturally against cluster bombs, but he does not want to fall into the arm of Biden. Then people remembered, wait a second, Steinmeier knew about this German citizen Kurmatz, who was for many years sitting innocently in Guantanamo, and Steinmeier knew that, and he didn't do one thing. So people remember all of these things, and so anyway, coming back to the value-based order, I think that the basic problem is that we are in a situation where the whole world is evolving into a system. It's not yet clear where it will end up. I think this is the big challenge of our time, that we have right now the end of an old system. That system is ended for sure. Nothing will bring the genie back into the bottle. But will the West cooperate with the Global South countries, the countries of Africa, Latin America, Asia, which is the reasonable thing? We would not need a conflict at all if the West would decide to cooperate with the global South. So it is up to us, the people of Germany, the United States, basically, to make sure that the confrontation is not the only game in town. And the only way how we can make that sure is we have to be heard, we have to be seen, we have to demonstrate, we have to go to rallies, we have to become politically active. And I think that will decide the answer to the question.
Well, you're listening to Helga Zepp-LaRouche. This is our weekly live stream webcast, and you can send questions or comments to questions@schillerinstitute.org. But on the question I just asked was specifically about India. Do you think that the effort by Biden and Blinken is going to work with India?
Well, I mean, as I said, they will try everything to pull the whole countries of the global South. They travel to Brazil, to Africa, to all kinds of places, to India. There was a whole, bunch of these people, von der Leyen and various other people. But, I mean, there was a big concern that when Modi went to the United States, that he would end up joining global NATO. I was a little bit skeptical because I have a lot of friends from, many years of friendship with India. And they all said, no, India will remain independent. And it turned out that, Modi went to the United States. He, had a friendship with the United States. But then he came back, I think it was after the Paris meeting. He called up Putin to report to him, to assure him that the friendship with Russia is in a long duration and it will remain. So I think, my gut feeling is that, while there is all kinds of maneuvering and putting efforts to, use the Pakistan-India conflict, use the tensions with China, use all kinds of regional conflicts to manipulate the situation. But I think India is basically, a country which says, look, we are by now the country with the most people, more than China by now. We have a very fast growing economy. We have one of the ancient civilizations on this globe. So I don't think that India will be pulled into these games, even there are dangers without any question. But I think the non-aligned tradition of India is stronger.
Now, here's a question from John Crow, who asks, how can NATO consider Ukraine membership? Russia has defined this as a red line. This would commit NATO to World War III. And he's basically asking, how can they be so suicidal?
Well, they clearly are. And, I think the establishment of the West, there's not so much different. I mean, the United States, Great Britain, and the EU. I mean, they're really. I think they have lost any sense of reality. I mean, they're saying things. If you would have somebody from a previous generation, let's say Franz Josef Strauss in Germany, or Herbert Wehner, or Helmut Schmidt, and they would listen to what these people are saying, they would say, where did these people come from? What movie are they in? I think that they really suffer all from a complete loss of reality. And, I think they believe their own propaganda. I mean, they have put so much effort into, making the NATO propaganda, the Western propaganda about we, the beautiful, we, the good ones, we who are always right, we who are based on values. I mean, this is such an arrogance, and, as if these other countries don't have values. I mean, I don't want to open now a big fuss of excitements because I don't think it's the main issue. But in the West, they're pushing this LBGT question. Russia and China and many other countries refuse that because they say this is totally against our traditional values. who are based on Christianity or Confucianism or whatever, and we want to keep our values. So who are these people in the West to say that these are autocrats and dictators just because they don't want their values being ruined and other values being imposed which are alien to their own culture and tradition? I mean, the only somebody who's completely taken in by their own propaganda, and it's massive, it's in all the public TV and radios and so. Only if you are intoxicated by what you put out 24 hours a day, that you could have such a loss of reality. But, there is a growing discrepancy between what the people think in almost every country in the so-called West and the so-called establishments. And I think that rift will become bigger and bigger and bigger, because what these governments are pushing is just not in the interest of their own populations. So I think that rift will manifest itself pretty soon, even more than now.
Now, Helga, we had a very interesting science panel taking up the climate question at the recent conference in France. And there's a question from JT, who's referring to the heat wave in the southwest of the United States. And he asks, so if Phoenix is in danger of a blackout that would kill 9 times more people than Hurricane Katrina, why are we just watching it happen instead of acting on the threat? And the implication being that the energy policy of the United States leaves people vulnerable to these changes and extremes. So the question is, why are we just watching it instead of doing something?
Well, almost every single so-called climate abnormality or, emergency and this can be proven in every single case, is the result of a lack of investment in infrastructure, energy, water management, or any such infrastructural measures. I mean, look, if people are honest, there were heat waves before. I remember in 1976, I was traveling in France because I had political meetings, and I was traveling along the river of Loire, which is one beautiful castle after the other, and the entire Loire had disappeared because there was a drought. That same year was the best wine. They said it's the century wine, because if you have a lot of sun and certain conditions, the wine gets very good. These things happened before. And, at the science panel, it was, again, absolutely emphatically demonstrated by Italian and German and other scientists, which has been said many times before, that the weather changes in the absolute most part are the result of cycles in the solar system, cycles which have absolutely nothing to do with the so-called anthropogenic activity. And therefore, I think that the only answer is we have to have investments in water management, investments in infrastructure which can cope with, let's say, floods or droughts. For example, if you manage forests, if you actually treat forests as a almost like a part of agriculture, you don't have these kinds of devastating fires. So all of these things, or take the example of the terrible flood in Germany 2 years ago in the river valley of the Ahr, where almost 200 people drowned in the middle of Germany. Why? Now they say this was climate change. It was not climate change. They had eliminated certain certain areas where the water could have been collected in case of such a flood. That was eliminated for cost reason or even greeny reasons. So all of these cases, if you know what is the scope of weather possibilities, you can manage all of these things and you can adjust it and have functioning systems. And even if you have a climate change in one or the other direction, you have to adapt to it. Greenland was green at a certain point. there were grapes for wine being produced in what is Great Britain today. In Siberia, you had fruits grown, which now is completely impossible because of permafrost. In the Sahara Desert, you had beautiful giraffes eating fig trees. The reason why we know that is because there are caves, where cave painting shows large animals eating fruits. Now, this is a desert today. How did people in the middle of the desert get the idea to make such a painting? Because such a thing existed. So I think the answer to all of that is investment in infrastructure. Then, to reconquer the desert, have large-scale desalination of ocean water, reconquer areas which have now been desertified, have now become deserts, and you can approach. To look at China, for example, they have created a forest in an area of the size of Germany. Now, can you imagine what that does to the climate? This is an area where a desert existed before. These kinds of things are eminently possible, and the fact that they are not being done are being misused to construct a fairy tale about man-made climate change.
Well, and Helga, here's a final question that actually goes back to what we were talking before about the Global South. It's from our friend Jerry, the motorcycle cowboy. He asks, regardless of how large the Southern coalition, the Global South, grows, what is their strength to overthrow the unipolar order?
Well, they are the majority of the human population. They already represent something like 80% of all people living on this planet. They have very quickly growing dynamic economies. And I think what is also very important, there is right now in several countries a leadership existing who are intellectually extremely excellent, morally excellent. And I think, since there are not one, but many, I think the possibility that this process will be reversed, I don't see it. I mean, if you have nuclear war, then everybody will be dead. But short of that, I think, these countries don't plan to overthrow the one unipolar world. They're just insisting of having a multipolar world, and that exists already. I have been making the point for a very long time that a multipolar world is better than an unipolar world, because an unipolar world can only function on the basis of a state conception like the Leviathan, the idea that the people are bad and therefore you need a strong military power to contain them, which is exactly the opposite of what John Quincy Adams called for. He said the United States should not go out and fight foreign monsters, or Kennedy in the famous peace speech where he said, the United States should not try to have a Pax Americana, which is being kept by weapons in one piece, by the real peace. But I have been making the point that even multipolarity is not good enough, because potentially it does still have the germ of geopolitics, meaning that a group of nations has one interest against the interest of another group of nations, and that still has the germ of a potential world war. I think we have to move to a completely new paradigm, a paradigm where the one humanity is in the minds of everybody first, and that the legitimate patriotic impulse to fight for your nation's interest is not in contradiction to the interest of the one humanity. And I think that cohesion is what we have to move towards. And that was the subject of our just concluded conference of the Schiller Institute in Strasbourg. And I can only encourage you to look at that, because it was really an extraordinary conference in terms of the quality of the speakers, the level of discussion, and I think you will gain a lot of hope by watching this.
Well, Helga, I did get a note from someone who was at the conference who said, congratulations to Helga, the French organization, and the Schiller Institute for an extraordinary conference. We'll be making the videos available, I think, in the next 24 hours or so. So look for them on the Schiller Institute website. Helga, thanks again for joining us, and we'll see you again next week.
Yes, till next week, and become active with us.